From biplanes to fast jets, a pilot's life in the Royal Air Force from 1942 to 1973. It's a fascinating and richly full-colour illustrated memoir from a Royal Air Force pilot, detailing his personal experiences during what could be described as a golden age of British military aviation from the Second World War to the 70s. He joined the Air Force in 1942, aged 18. He would have turned 100 this year. I'm delighted to say that his son, Mark Aedy, joins me live on the line now. Good morning to you, Mark.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And whereabouts are you this morning?
I'm sitting in my house in central London.
Very, very nice. I thought you might be on an airfield somewhere, you know. Look,
unfortunately not. I wish I was.
Yeah, indeed. Now, tell me a little bit about your father, because he would have been 100. He left us only a few years ago, I believe.
So, yeah, you're right. He was 100 last Wednesday, and we launched the book from Biplanes to Fast Jets last Wednesday at the Royal Air Force Club, which was a joy. I had 180 guests to celebrate the launch. He wrote the memoirs in the 2 or 3 years before he sadly faded away in 2001 after quite a long illness. But it covers the period, as you've indicated, from 1942 through to the very late 50s. So he goes from biplanes sort of made out of paper and glue through to being operational Lancasters in the Second World War, and then transitions on to fast jets like the Meteor, the Hunter, and his favourite, the Javelin.
I mean, it really is this period we're talking about, and I know now that everything is sort of is controlled by computers, and you've got a huge amount of technical staff behind you. But it's Tiger Moth. It is basically paper aeroplanes with bits of. I mean, you look at them now in an aircraft museum, and you just go, chapeau, as the saying goes, to anybody who wants to get up. I mean, I wouldn't take one of those things out of the car park. Never mind take it to 10,000 feet or something.
Well, he loved the Tiger Moth. He first flew it in the UK when it was freezing cold in October, November, December 42, and sort of froze to death. But then actually, once he joined the RAF in 42, in 43, he got transferred to be formally taught to fly in Oklahoma in 1943. And then he, again, arrived in Oklahoma on the 1st of April 43 and went solo in a Tiger Moth in 12 days later on the 12th of April 43, and then transitioned on to slightly more sophisticated biplanes like the Harvard and the Stearman.
Quite a thing to be over in. This is one of the stories that gives the RAF, if you like, an advantage, because the young men who are going to go and fight in Northern Europe a little bit later on in the campaign, are able to get sort of hundreds of hours, aren't they, of flying time in the flats, in the good weather and large open spaces of the US, be it Florida, be it Oklahoma, or be it in California, which is invaluable when they're sent back to Europe.
That's right. My understanding is there were 3 places to go and train, because obviously it was a bit hairy training in the UK because the UK was under siege, and those 3 places,
hills, that sort of hills and mountains and fog and that sort of thing as well don't help.
And lousy weather, and you're right, hills. So the 3 options were South Africa, Canada, and the US. And indeed, Dad talks in the book about being issued with pith helmets and shorts. So he thought, great, I'm off to South Africa. That changes. He goes with a stack of other trainee pilots on the converted Queen Mary Cunard liner, converted into a troop ship, lands in New Brunswick, 4-day train ride to Ponca City, Oklahoma. And exactly as you say, beautiful weather, blue skies, but flat as a pancake. So where he got trained effectively by bush pilots, not really the US Army Air Corps, which is the precursor to the US Air Force. So they were bush pilots, a bit short on instructional technique, but terribly gifted technically.
And it must, because I mean, now obviously you just leap on a plane and go, you're in Florida, you're in New York or Florida in a couple of hours. But obviously, for a young man at that point to be in America, must have been quite an adventure, to put it mildly. I mean, going by a cruise liner as well, albeit converted. But this is the sort of thing you saw in the cinemas and the movies. Once a week on a Friday evening, and there he is, landing in the States.
It's crazy. Number of things that come out of that journey, both going to the States and coming back. He couldn't get over arriving in Canada and getting fresh food because, of course, the UK was under rations then, fresh eggs, fresh tomatoes and that sort of thing. Couldn't believe how warm everywhere was. It was properly heated. Hops on the train, and sort of as the further south they go, the warmer they get. Every station they stop at, they're required to get in their uniform and get greeted by the local population, incredibly well treated. Arrive in Ponca City and fabulously looked after by the local people. Very affectionate comments by Dad in the book about how much he enjoyed America. And then, would you believe, he comes back, not on the Queen Mary, but on the, I've got my boats run the wrong way. He went out on the converted Queen Elizabeth. He comes back on the converted Queen Mary. Ooh. But he said, rather curiously, having sailed past the Statue of Liberty in New York, they head south very quickly and then zigzag across the Atlantic. And Dad learned subsequently, the boat absolutely full of troops and trained pilots, they were zigzagging across the Atlantic to avoid U-boats. But he only found that out subsequently, so I think he was relaxed post the event, so to speak.
So when did he arrive back in the UK?
So he came back late 43, and you raise a very important point. What's astonishing is, despite the hit rate, the dreadful casualty rate in Bomber Command, which you would think would have accelerated the training, he spends effectively the whole of 43 and much of 44 in training. So by the time he actually gets operational, he's had a lot of hours, and when he came back, he converted very quickly to a small twin-engine transport plane called the Oxford, which he says he realised he was destined for bombers. He then trains on Wellingtons, does many hours on Wellingtons, and finally becomes operational on Lancasters.
It's interesting because everybody, every small boy wants to be a Spitfire pilot, don't they? That's the thing. But they don't need, they don't, at this point in the war. Harris is doing, Operation Point Blank. It's a strategic thing of shall we say, reducing German morale, to put it mildly, with a bombing campaign. Wellington's two-engine bomber, isn't it? And so that's a sort of medium bomber. But then you get the Lank, which is, I mean, it's a game changer. It is absolutely state of the art, and in a way, he's somewhat fortunate that he's not involved in the maelstrom of late 43 through to 44. And I know we're talking because of the casualty rate, because there aren't the pursuit aircraft to go with. And if you think about what happens with the Scheinfeld raids in Germany at that part, 43, 44, if you've seen Master of the Air, I know it's an American point of view, but the British were doing it, the RF were doing it at night, and that brings its own dramas as well. So he is, I'm not saying it's not dangerous, but I mean, he comes in again at an important point of the war, and presumably is he involved in anything like against Berlin at this point, or what's his story?
First of all, your observations about the relative risk are completely accurate. Honestly, Dad is standing on my shoulder now saying, don't misrepresent what I did. I caught the end of the war when, broadly speaking, the battle in the air was won, when Dad became fully operational. The statistics, nevertheless, are really stark. You'll be familiar with them. 125,000 bomber crew in Bomber Command in the Second World War, 57,000 killed, 8,000 injured, so 1 in 2. It had the highest casualty rate of any operation of either side, the only second highest only to U-boats. Now, but Dad is sitting on my shoulder saying, I caught the end of it. Although, and I've got the report in the book. I put the report that he had on the Potsdam raid he participated in April 45.
Right.
Potsdam being one of the big military areas north of Berlin, effectively at the limit of the Lancasters' endurance, and one of those sort of famous 700-800 plane raids. He says all fine going out, then sort of all hell lets loose, searchlights, flak, etc. And as they're turning to leave, having dropped their bomb load, he gets attacked by a Messerschmitt 262, which is the first operational jet.
Oh, wow. Yes. Yes.
And in his report, he talks about being encountered at 100 yards and 400 yards. Can you believe that? So close. Anyway, so I think it remained dangerous. There's quite a lot of reference to collisions on the way to raids, some very desperate stories about planes falling out the sky, having been hit, etc. But I emphasize much of the book, frankly, as a love story about flying, to which he was absolutely devoted.
And he also gets involved as well, doesn't he, with the Manor raids, which again, if you've been watching Masters of the Air, you'll have seen the United States American Air Force, Army Air Force, doing those raids. But these incredible things to stop the Hunger Winter in Holland, which again, we're having to have a reappraisal, aren't we, of Bomber Command, because it's had such a bad name, and they really were hung out to dry.
Well, let me tackle both things. Yes, he was involved in Operation Manor, and he was very proud to be involved in Operation Manor. He went on 2 missions, dropping food supplies on some football fields in Rotterdam, and then 2 days later in The Hague. And the account of those missions is very heartwarming and touching. He recounts seeing a nun fall off her bicycle as she races to pick up some food, and people cheering as they fly over. It was not without risk. They had to fly very, very low and very, very slowly, and the Germans were still there. So they had to sort of have faith that everybody got the memo not to shoot at them.
Yeah.
But I think he was very pleased about that. And, all of 3 or 4 weeks later, he was involved right at the end of the war in early May, before the end of the war in Europe is declared, in returning prisoners of war on the last leg of their journey back to UK, having done the incredible great march back from Poland and Germany. So he did quite a bit of humanitarian work, quite apart from the, more fabled bombing raids.
And just briefly. So we'll move on, because otherwise it's going to be all sorts of World War II centric. But Bomber Command, it's only recently we're having a reappraisal of their role, and these young men and the incredible. I mean, I'm just currently reading Pathfinders, the book, and it's just, you read that and you just go, ye gods. I mean, anybody who was involved in any of those operations, be it even if you were a German night fighter, I mean, just horrendous.
Very brave. So a few observations about that. One is Dad was hugely impressed by the bravery of the Pathfinder crews, because those pilots, which included Sir Leonard Cheshire, they'd done 2 operational missions. Now, I think tours, and I think a tour was 35 missions. So they'd done 70 missions. And can you believe they then get it back into the plane and fly unescorted? I mean, incredible danger, full of admiration for those people. He was full of admiration for the United States Air Force flying during daylight, although flying at night, as you hinted, was not without risk either. On the philosophical point about Bomber Harris and area bombing, pattern bombing, call it what you will, Dad, who was a very warm and gentle man, was very happy to talk about the war. He felt very uncomfortable talking about the fact that women and children could have been caught in the area bombing. When I pressed him on it, when I was 40 odd when he finally faded away, so we did talk about it quite a bit. he used to get quite direct with me with a view to closing the conversation down by saying, Mark, you need to understand, by the end of 44, we were all aware of the concentration camps. We'd been at war for getting on for 5 years. It needed to finish, and this was part of finishing it. I think he was very frustrated there was no campaign medal for Bomber Command as a result of the controversy around Bomber Harris's tactics. Having said that, some immensely brave squadrons also didn't get it. Coastal Command, for example, and Transport Command didn't either. He was not here, unfortunately, when the memorial in Green Park was established, the Bomber Command Memorial, just opposite the RAF club in High Corner. I think he would have been very proud about that. But I think you're right. There were some rather important moral questions raised, which I think Dad, look, he was doing his duty.
Yeah. And we were at war, and 44, the first V1 start landing, and then of course the V2 start landing. So there is a purchase needed. Let's move on. The war finishes. He doesn't leave the RAF. He loves his flying. He stays with the RAF. He goes to Egypt. So from the coldness of Holland and whatever to the baking heat of the deserts of Egypt.
He had a wonderful time, You're absolutely right. The overwhelming majority of people decommissioned. Dad was devoted to the Royal Air Force, but devoted to flying. So in 48, he gets posted to Egypt just as Israel's becoming independent. And there was a lot of uncertainty, a very current topic now, between the newly emerged Israel and the Palestinian population. So there was elements of demonstration of commitment and force, etc. My father was, like me, very tall and slim, so there are some fairly ugly photographs of him in shorts.
Right.
And then, all of 2 years later, he goes out on a rather pleasant steamship to Singapore, where he ultimately meets my mother, who was working for the security service for MI5. They get married in St. Andrew's Cathedral in Singapore, and Dad flies to Korea, Tokyo, Okinawa, Nicobar Islands, etc. Quite a remarkable experience. By which time he's transitioning onto jets.
Yeah. Now jets. You see, you mentioned the 262. The Messerschmitt 262, which thankfully they didn't have an awful lot of, and they were a bit unstable. Jets in the late 40s, early 50s. I mean, little bit interesting, I should imagine. The principles are still the same, but we are at the beginning of the jet age.
Yes. So he talks a bit about the excitement of going on to jets. He talks in particular, one of the early operational jets for the Air Force was a plane called the Vampire. And he talks about, the thrill of the speed and the thrust and that sort of thing, but also the maneuverability and the acrobatic capability compared to some of the slightly more leaden planes, propeller planes he'd flown before, although he briefly flew Spitfires, which he thought were absolutely magnificent. So he loved the transition, but exactly as you say, it was not without risk. He tells a harrowing story, and I guess this must be in the early 50s, where a Hunter squadron goes out probably a little bit to press on. Fog covers the northern part of England, and they haven't got appropriate technical radar and landing kit. So all 9 Hunters crash land, killing the pilots.
Jeez.
I mean, just terrifying. And the other thing which comes throughout the book, be it Tiger Moss or Stearman or Wellingtons or Lancasters or jets, is the number of people that actually get killed in training. It was not without risk.
Yeah, it's funny you should mention Vampires, and I'll digress, but there used to be a little second line hole-in-the-wall bar in Puerto Banús, which is the marina down here, and it was run by a guy called Reggie Webster. It was called Webster's, and Reggie was a vampire man, and he would turn up every night with his red trousers, his red shirt, a resplendent white, at this point he must have been in his 80s or something. He's Reggie, and his wife Barbara would who was a real gal, would sit at the end of the bar all night, chain smoking. But he was always, you asked him what he flew, he was vampires, dear boy. That was his thing.
Wonderful.
When did he leave Reggie's favourite was the Vampire, but what was your father's favourite of the jets then?
So I think the simple answer is I think he loved absolutely everything.
Right.
But the overwhelming favourite was the javelin, which he went solo on in 1958. And he really enjoyed that. Based in the UK, he did a lot of time in meteors in Germany, in RAF Alhorn, all part of the sort of Cold War.
Army, the Army of the Rhine and then that sort of thing, yeah? And that whole thing.
Precisely. But he loved the manoeuvrability of the javelin. It was a beautiful looking plane, and there are some rather splendid photographs in the book of various sort of acrobatics that were done, including pictures of Dad flying, which are very satisfying. And subsequent to that, he then moved into intelligence and away from operational flying, which is when we as a family were posted to Cyprus in the mid-late 60s as part of just as the Middle East crisis was sort of boiling up.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. My grandfather was and my uncles were in Cyprus in the mid-60s as well, in Berengaria and Nicosia and
Limassol. Yes, right. Well, next door.
Next door, indeed. So, small world indeed. There you go. What's he'd been encouraged. This was something that he was encouraged to do by presumably your sister or yourself, and say, Dad, make a few notes. It's been such a fascinating period of time.
Well, I fear I have to thank my wife, because Dad very sadly had his first of 3 heart attacks in a 3-month period in early 1973. The first, would you believe, shockingly, taking me to my first football game to watch at Wembley, and he collapsed on Wembley Tube Underground Station, and he went from this incredibly vital, alive, engaging man to sadly being beleaguered for actually the balance of his life until he faded away in 2001. In the late 90s, I was married and had 3 little children who are now grown-up adults. But my wife, to whom my father was devoted, is Belgian and therefore rather direct. And she looked at my dad, who was, as I said earlier, a kind and gentleman, and said, Ken, before you fade away, can you write down on 2 pieces of paper what you did in the war? To which Dad, with a quiet smile and a glint in his eyes, said, well, Deanne, it's not my current intention to fade away anytime soon, but since you ask, I will. And, we never heard anything about it. We didn't want to press him on it because he was unwell. And I fear that when he finally faded away in November 2001, not surprisingly, my sister and I were at home with Mum. Yeah. And Mum said to me, darling, go upstairs because I think Dad's written something down for the children. I mean, Mum's grandchildren, Mum and Dad's grandchildren, my children. And I swear to God, I went up to his room and on a hand-crank computer, almost a sort of Wurlitzer, produced 90 pages of close type, which is the foundation of the book. And of course, as you can imagine, as a exuberant son, I said, I'm going to publish it. Anyway, it's taken me 23 years to do it. But in the last 2 years, we've been assembling photographs from the period, paintings from the planes he flew. And I've got pictures of every plane he flew, plus the events he witnessed, be it the Berlin airlift, the first ever Battle of Britain fly past over Buckingham Palace, the Korean War, dancing with Rita Hayworth, seeing General MacArthur. He had the most wonderful time. And he couldn't believe that his day job was doing something he loved in flying.
And it was a time when, flying was pioneering, exciting, and you were rubbing shoulders with glamour, and it's interesting. What do you hope that people will take from biplanes to fast planes? What do you hope they discover?
Sorry, I missed
What do you hope that people will learn from the book?
Well, first of all, I hope they get a sense of his warmth of character and a sense of humour. That's an important part of it. It's what it isn't. It's not the story of some Second World War hero. My father would be deeply alarmed if I presented him as that, particularly as he lost so many friends who made the ultimate sacrifice. What it really is a story of an ordinary young man who witnessed extraordinary events in a period of, enormous geopolitical turmoil. Emergence of the Cold War, end of the Second World War, events in Korea, etc., but also staggering technological change. If you think about it, from 42 to 57, he went from these basic single propeller biplanes through to fast jets. It's astonishing. And all the fun, really, he had on the way, putting aside some of the more harrowing stories. It's a very warm and affectionate book. He had a glint in his eye. And I think, without being too earnest, I hope we've done him justice with the book, but in a small way made a gesture of tribute to his generation, and thinking about D-Day as we are now.
Sure.
That generation is very nearly not with us anymore, and we mustn't forget what they did for us.
But one of the things is, as this generation fades away, more and more stories are coming out like this. We're finding more and more personal stories by people.
I hope so.
People are going up to attics and finding stuff. And I was speaking to Damien Lewis the other day, the author, and he was saying to anybody, if they got, if there's a trunk that's not been opened in your attic, go and open it, for goodness sake, because especially now these stories are being told, and it just you just nailed it. The fact that technology just takes a massive leap in that 15-year period, and you think, what? And from one minute you're in a Tiger Moth, and the next minute you're in a fast jet.
Yeah. So, and the other thing is, it was an absolute joy to sort of what happened is, about 2.5 years ago, probably the back end of COVID, I sort of realised, my God, Dad would have been 100. I better get on with it, rather than just talking about it, do something. And then I just went on this wonderful journey, having never published anything in my life. Got publishers on board at White Fox who are wonderful picture collators, photograph collators. I gave an internship to a wonderful young woman called Catherine Chapman, who's an undergrad at Durham University, where I went 150 years ago.
Yes, indeed.
And she was the driving force in our engagement with the RAF Museum and the United States Air Force Museum, the librarian in the public library in Ponca City, Oklahoma. And we had great fun pulling everything together. And I hope we've done Dad justice.
I think you've done him more than justice. The book is called From Biplanes to Fast Jets, A Pilot's Life in the Royal Air Force. It's by Ken Aedy. Ken, are you online? Can people find you via the web?
If you look up Ken Aedy Memoirs on Amazon, that's where you can source the book. If you felt remotely inclined to make a contribution to the RAF Benevolent Fund, there's a place to do that on the Benevolent Fund's website. And you can find me, Mark Aedy, on LinkedIn.
Marvellous. And it's Aedy, spelled A-E-D-Y. The book, you'll also be able to order the book, by the way, via our own virtual bookstore. The book is called From Biplanes to Fast Jets, A Pilot's Life in the Royal Air Force from 1942 to 1973. Brilliant stuff. It's been compiled by Mark Aedy. Mark, thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure, and thank you for taking the time to hear that story.